Hi, my name is Eda320, and I really like tanks. So much so, in fact, that I've decided to embark on a journey across the internet and gaming world alike to find some of the wackiest, coolest, and best made tanks in video games. I'll be looking at everything from the plausibly realistic to the downright insane.
War Thunder does not fundamentally understand the steering system of the Sherman. You put your foot on the gas and you have the tillers and you pull one back and the tank can turn in place on a dime. The Sherman cannot physically do this. This is impossible.
So if this sounds like something you're interested in, stick around and listen up, because this is a Tank Enthusiast Reacts to Tanks in Video Games.
Hello ladies and gentlemen of the World Wide Web, welcome back to Tank Enthusiast Reacts. Man, it's been a hot minute since I've made one of these videos, and today's a special day. It's a new year, new Tank Enthusiast Reacts series, I guess, season 2. No, this is like season 3 at this point, but we're doing a game that has been highly requested, as you saw in the title and in the intro, War Thunder. I mean, this is the big one. This is the one that everyone says is more realistic than World of Tanks. Obviously, I don't want to turn this video into a War Thunder versus World of Tanks type thing. If you look at the channel, I've played both games, and I actually think both games are quite fun. I personally have a little bit more experience, actually a lot more experience with War Thunder. It is my personal game of choice. That's my 2 cents. That's my intro. I know I waffle on way too long in my intros, but I just want to say, welcome back to Tank Enthusiast Reacts, and today we're doing War Thunder. If you like what you see, leave a like and subscribe and do all that fun YouTube stuff. Join my Patreon if you haven't already. Join my Discord. I want to sneak all that in the beginning just so we can get it over with and just get to talking about tanks. So obviously, me being me, a majority of this video is going to focus on American tanks, specifically the M4 and M3. I'm sure I'll have cut up the bar down below into what tanks you might be interested in hearing me ramble about, but we start off with Shermans. I don't think I'm going too far by saying that War Thunder probably has some of the best high-fidelity models of tanks that personally I've ever seen in any video game. The amount of detail is just staggering. The textures are usually really good, and the models are just great. Like, the proportions are incredible. Everything looks big. I feel like it's one thing, I know I said I wasn't going to turn this into World of Tanks versus War Thunder, but one thing I noticed about World of Tanks is the camera is so zoomed out and all the tanks look so small. You don't really get a sense of how big these things are. Also, actually, I would say that even in War Thunder, it's really difficult in a video game to convey that size, even if you have little people standing next to your tanks, like you can get in the hangar. Or the default hangar, obviously. I have a modded hangar here because I love to mess with my games. Even I didn't quite realize just how big tanks are until you see them in real life. I mean, there's really no other way to do it. They feel a lot bigger, and to me, the proportions feel more correct than they do in a lot of other games, actually. An epic cameo here from the M2 medium, obviously the predecessor to the M4 and also the M3, but this tank has all the features of everything we'll end up seeing in both the M3 and the M4. See the R975 with the tilted drivetrain, so that's always been in these tanks, American medium tanks, since the M2. It's inherited by the M3, therefore inherited by the M4. We have on the back here the pepper pot exhausts, which is a really dumb exhaust system that is then inherited by the M3, fixed on the M3, and then not inherited by the M4. Hooray! The pepper pot exhaust system created a bottleneck in engine power and also reduced the service life of the engines. They wore out faster. So the pepper pot exhaust was just bad. Otherwise, the tank is represented great here. This is an actual M2. It's not an M4A2. It's actually an interesting note. I think I've mentioned it in the Tank Enthusiast Reacts to World of Tanks, but the M2 that they have in World of Tanks is an M4A1, but they just call it an M2. So that's small discrepancy there, whereas this one here, this is a genuine M2. You can tell because the turret, the walls are slanted in. The M4A1 turret walls are vertical. They did it to give more room in the turret. to the guys in there, as well as they messed around with the recoil mechanism for the 37, again, to make more room. Also, the tracks on the M2A1 would be wider, but it's such a small difference, it's barely noticeable, let alone in a video game. I love seeing these early American tanks represented in games, early tanks in general. I've always said my favorite era of the tank is the interwar, so anything from the 1930s actually being represented and something that you can play around with to this in a game like this always warms my heart to see, and it's modeled very, very well. Unfortunately, what they did not model are the deflector plates on the back of the M2, those little square metal plates. The purpose of those metal plates were that these backwards mounted sponson machine guns, you could direct those machine guns down into those plates, and the bullets would hit the inside of those plates and then ricochet downwards for when you're driving over trenches. You can shoot backwards and hit that plate, and then the bullet would deflect downwards into trenches. Actually, their purpose, I cannot tell you what they were smoking when they came up with that idea, but I want to taste, because wow, wow, wow. So of course, all the more frustrating that they seem to have not modeled it, which is so disappointing. They actually modeled the function. I give them credit for modeling all the machine guns are functional on the M2. I know there's a weird thing in War Thunder where for some reason the bow machine guns on like 90% of tanks in War Thunder are for some reason not modeled and you can't use them. I really don't know why they do that. Like, I seriously think this needs to be something that Gaijin should address, like sooner rather than later, please, because it's a serious like why can't I use the bow machine gun on a majority of tanks? That is really, really dumb. But at least on the M2, where kind of the whole gimmick of the thing is that it has a bunch of machine guns, at least all the machine guns on that tank are modeled, including the fixed forward-firing machine guns, which again are modeled on the M2, but not on the M3, if I'm not mistaken. Which again, why not? I know it has zero practical application in game. There is not a single situation in the game where you would ever need to use that. But come on, come on, why can't I? Moving forward in time, we have the M3. This M3 is also, again, modeled really, really well. I think it's just one thing we're going to see across War Thunder. Like, I really do think these guys have top-class models. This M3 really screams to me an earlier production model that has had things tacked onto it to keep it up to date as much as possible. Firstly, why is it an early model? Well, the big one to me is the fact that it still has its side doors. The side doors were deleted within the first 3 months of 1942. At first, they just welded the doors up, but then eventually a new side plate was manufactured that omitted the side doors. The US saw them as a ballistic weak point, and so we decided to get rid of them, much to the dismay of the Soviets. And also the Australians, I think, who complained that they received defective tanks because they no longer had side doors. Apparently everyone found those useful, I guess, said the US. Additional ventilators were added to the roof of the hull of the M3 and then also to the roof of the turret. This does not have those, so I assume this is an earlier model. Another really interesting thing about this tank is that it has the later style exhaust. So as I mentioned, the M3s originally came with the same pepper pot exhaust system that was on the M2. Bottleneck in power, reduce the engine's life, really, really bad, actually, like really bad. So it was decided, like, we gotta fix this. And so what they did was they remounted the air cleaners from inside the engine bay out to the outside, and that's what you see, these two like blocks on either side. Those are the air cleaners, air filters, and then the exhaust was moved up to the top above those doors, like the way that it is on the Sherman, because obviously the Sherman inherited those changes from the M3. However, on this specific tank, we can see these exhausts are down below the air cleaners. This is indicative of a quick fix exhaust kit. Originally, if you had that pepper pot exhaust, in the back plate of the tank, you had the two holes cut where the exhaust came out, and then it was piped up through those tubes to the pepper pot exhaust. Well, if you have these older tanks, their rear plates have those holes cut out in them, and just take the fishtail exhaust, plop those on the holes. Kit was issued for all the proper tools and these fishtail ends, and given out to crews and saying, hey, like, upgrade your own damn tank. This was something that could be done in the field, so you didn't have to wait for new tanks from the factory. But again, really cool modeling quirk of whatever M3 the developers decided to model had this quick fix exhaust, which is pretty cool. For me, that's really cool. When you notice those sorts of things in a game, like, it's really cool. I think it's really interesting. So I wanted to point that out for those of you who want to wow any of your friends. Next time you guys play War Thunder together and you say, hey, let's queue up for 2.7, I want to play with the M3, which I think no one has ever said ever in the history of War Thunder, you can annoy your friends with that little fun fact. As for the X-ray view, I noticed something very interesting. First of all, I don't think there's enough fuel tanks modeled on the back here. There should be the side sponson fuel tanks, I think, in the M3, just like there were in the Sherman, so I don't know why those aren't there. But then also, there's no radio in this tank. I totally, had to do a double take because I couldn't believe this, but they have all the crew members up at the front here. They've got the gunner with the loader behind him. They've got the driver sitting in the middle, and to the left of the driver, in his proper space, they have what should be the radio operator of the M3, because famously, the M3 had the radio mounted down in the hull, which, by the way, if you noticed, pay attention earlier, that's also where it was on the M2. So you may say, why did the Americans do that? Well, it's just because that's just how it was. In American doctrine, that's how it was. The radio was in the hull and operated by a dude. In the smaller tanks, like the M2 lights, and what would become the Stuart, it was a dude sitting next to the driver who had a bow machine gun and the radio in the hull. So it's just how they did things in the U.S. Army at the time. This is not the T-34. It should have a radio from day one. There was no issue of radios in M3 production, so there's no reason why an M3 shouldn't have its radio. And then more so, the guy is labeled, when you hover over him with your little mousy mouse, he's labeled as a machine gunner, which I don't know why, because there's no machine gun there for him to operate. Maybe they got confused and thought that this is the guy who operated the twin fixed forward firing machine guns at the front, but no, those would have been operated by the driver. He had little buttons on his tillers. And actually also, really fun, those two machine guns there, they actually had elevation and depression. They were not completely fixed hull-mounted machine guns. They could move up and down. They just couldn't go left and right, which is quite funny. On the flip side of the M3 Lee, we have the M3 Grant. Now, this is specifically the Grant from the American tech tree, which I think is cool that they have a Grant available in the American tech tree as a premium, but it is worth noting that I have, in all my research on the M3, I've not stumbled across a single instance of American soldiers using the M3 Grant. The M3 Lee was the de facto American version, and the M3 Grant was the de facto British version. Due to production numbers and the British needing tanks very desperately, they do end up breaking the rule, and American Lee tanks do end up being used by the British, but British Grant tanks never end up being used by the Americans, as far as I know. So for a British Grant tank to be in the American tech tree doesn't make sense. For the purposes of letting you play with both variants in the same tech tree, I totally get it, and it is pretty cool. It's a great model. It's kind of the same thing that I got out of the Lee, where it seems like an early model that has some extra add-on bits to it. Oh, most notably, I should have said, in the M3, the American M3, both the 37mm gun and the 75 were both fitted with stabilizers, and we can tell this because they had the counterweights on them. The 75 has that big, gawky counterweight clamp on the front of the gun barrel, and then the 37 has a counterweight tube underneath the barrel of the 37. A lot of people think it's the recoil mechanism or housing for a spring. It is, but it's not that long. There's a little peg there that is the housing for the spring, I'm pretty sure, and then they add onto it a longer weighted tube to act as a counterweight for when the stabilizer is installed in the tank. And I do think, in the X-ray of the M3, I do think they should model all the gubbins for the stabilizer. People might hate me for suggesting this, but I do think it would be cool if you could knock out the stabilizer. I think that would be neat. I think that would make for cool gameplay, okay? Sue me. Oh, and you can't repair it because the actual tankers in World War II didn't know how to repair it either, because they were never told how to repair it because the stabilizer was such a secretive item. So there's a myth out there that the stabilizer on the Sherman and stuff didn't work. It's not that it didn't work, it's just that it was literally so top secret of an item, it was so special of an item, that the crews were literally not taught what it was or how it worked. I mean, I think it was mentioned, I mean, it's obviously going to be mentioned in the manual, but there was no training for it, and obviously what it did provide was kind of arguably marginal. So the bottom line was the stabilizer worked, but when it broke, nobody bothered to fix it because they didn't know how and they didn't care to learn how. There was one unit that actually bothered to learn how the stabilizer worked and how to properly maintain them and care for them and fix them when they broke, and that particular unit did swear by the stabilizer. They really liked them, but most units did not because they didn't even know. The reason why I bring that up is the 75 mil on this Grant tank has the counterweight, so it does have a stabilizer, but the 37 on the roof does not have the counterweight for whatever reason. I'm not sure why, but it doesn't. So theoretically, when using this tank in-game, your 75 should be stabilized, but your 37 should not. But when playing this tank in game, obviously both guns are stabilized because, you know, I get it. And so even if it did have a stabilizer, I don't think it would work because you need the counterweight for the stabilizer to properly function. Either way, that is a funny modeling oversight. Otherwise, it's a great example of an M3 Grant. Quick note that the fenders on this variant of the Grant are very boxy. It comes across, there's an angle here, and then a straight flat front bit. That shows that these are American factory implemented sand skirts. The British made their own sand skirts initially as field mods, and they were curved at the front. So this is also quite criminal in my humble opinion. We have a version of the M3 Grant that is in the British tech tree, but it's also a premium. I understand the Grant being a premium vehicle in the US tech tree. Yeah, we understand they never used it, but it's here in the tech tree because it is still there. It is still an American tank. But for the British to not have either a Grant or a Lee in their tech tree as standard non-premium vehicles, that to me is genuinely crazy. That's insane. The M3 Grant was an incredibly important tank for the British in the North African theater and in the Southeast Asian Pacific theater, the Burma campaign, the race to Rangoon. The M3 was the tank, like it really was. It was the tank of the British Commonwealth forces during that time. I mean, Australia got them, Canada got them, everyone got them, and they were used very heavily. You can't represent North Africa without the M3, especially for the British. You can argue, oh, it was not a British tank, but the Sherman is right there in the British tech tree. And it's the early variant. It's the M4A1 early style, clearly a reference to North African M4A1 Shermans, or in this case, the Sherman 2. It does not sit right with me that you cannot have either a Grant or a Lee in the British tech tree without premium. That to me is really sad. As for the premium Grant, I mean, it looks like it's basically identical to the Grant that's in the American tech tree as a premium. For whatever reason, it doesn't have full equipped sand skirts, which is weird because out of both sides, the British and the Americans, the British were the ones who use the sand skirts the most. So if you're gonna have a variant of the Grant not have sand skirts or not have fully equipped sand skirts, it should be the American one, because Americans were generally the ones who didn't much care for sand skirts. Also, the British one being the OD green. When M3s showed up in Britain or with the British, they showed up in factory American olive drab paint, although the British did request that they paint them in different colors, and I think at one point Chrysler, I think, may be obliged with that for a short period of time. But then I think the British actually went back and said, never mind, just give us OD green, we'll paint them ourselves. So I guess to get pedantic about the paint job maybe is a little too far, even for this series. But interesting that, again, the American tech tree one seems to be desert tan, but the British tech tree one seems to be OD green. Like, I think the premium Grant in the British tech tree and the premium Grant in the American tech tree should be swapped. Like, really, it's odd. It's really odd what they've done. Shout out, we get a great view though on the back of the WD212, also known as double I tracks, also called double H tracks, because it can either be two uppercase H's side by side, or it can be two uppercase I's that have been flipped sideways and put butt to butt. I call them double I tracks because that's what it looks like to me. But WD212 tracks, shout out that on both Grants, these are the tracks that are used because these tracks are uniquely Grant. No M3 Lees ever left the factory with these tracks. No Shermans ever left the factory with these tracks. These tracks, only the Grant used them, and every single Grant came out of the factory with them. So these are the definitive Grant tank tracks. So if you, again, any game developers out there, if you're modeling an M3 Grant, give it WD212 tracks. Whether it's being used by the British, whether it's being used by the Australians, it literally doesn't matter. Every Grant should have these tracks, and no other tank ever should use these tracks. Obviously, in the field, I'm sure anything goes, right? I'm sure tracks got swapped around all the time. I don't know why I'm harping on it so much, but I really think it's important because I think it's cool and unique. Also, before we get off of the M3, I just have to say as a last thing, why do we not have any other variants of the M3 model? The M3A1, dude, they made 300 of those tanks. They definitely existed. The M3A1 is the reason that the M4A1 Sherman exists. Like, that was those original tests with that cast armor is what gave America such a boner for cast armor in World War II. An incredibly important vehicle in the developmental stepping stone between the M3 and the M4. Also, yeah, why no welded hull tanks? The M4A2 and the M4A3 were both welded hull vehicles. Just like the M4 Sherman, the M3 came in the variety of engines, as I kind of already discussed. Twin diesel, radial gas, and A57 multibank, All three of those engines were used in the M3. I think, I really don't know why Gaijin would be watching this video, but if for whatever reason anyone who has any influence at Gaijin is watching this video, I seriously think adding the M4A1, the M4A3, and the M4A4 would be great additions to War Thunder. I really do. M4A1, it's got the radial engine, all the early features, but cast hull, so it's got a better armor construction, right? I think that would make for great gameplay. M4A3, welded hull, diesel engine tank. So you got a different engine, so you can make the performance better. Welded hull, I guess you can probably, something with overpressure or something. In reality, it was about spalling and getting rid of rivets, but I'm sure you can find some way, Gaijin, to make that armor a little bit better. At the very least, it'll look different, and, you know, Lord knows you have no problem adding two of basically the same tank, but they look slightly different. And then the M4A4, obviously being the Chrysler multibank engine, the hull is longer, it has the longer 75, because the M4A4 was introduced at the very end of the M3's production life, so it got all the late features, meaning it had no side doors, and it got the longer M3 gun, the gun that ends up in the Sherman, the 75mm gun M3. So having a variant of the M3 in War Thunder that uses the same gun as the Sherman, that would be pretty awesome. That makes for cool gameplay. And again, the A57, the multi-bank, you already have the M4A4 in the game, so just copy paste the performance, you know? I think there's a lot of really, really cool and interesting things you can do if you add specifically those three variants of the M3 to War Thunder, and you can do them all as Lees. In fact, actually, only the M4A3 would have a Grant variant. The M4A4 was only ever made as a Lee, and also the M4A1 was only ever made as a Lee. They should all go in the American tech tree. If you want, actually, you could add the M4A3 Grant to the British tech tree. You could add it as an Australian vehicle. Take the Grant in the British tech tree, as it is now, make it a normal vehicle, non-premium, and then put a premium Australian M4A3 welded hull diesel engine Grant as a premium. Boom. I'm not kidding, I would buy it. I'm not kidding, I would buy it. Anyways, there's a lot of room for M3 lore expansion in War Thunder, and I think it's a shame that the tank is so ignored, because I really think the M3 is a really, really cool tank. And if you'd like to learn more about it, even more than I've already spouted in this video, I have a 2-part video series dissecting the entire history of the M3 Lee from start to finish, every single variant they ever made, and how it came about. So if you're interested, really, please check that out. I think it would be really cool. I don't know how I'm going to turn this into a cohesive video, but we're just gonna go. Of course, we can't talk about the M2 or the M3 without eventually leading into the M4. I actually do really like the way War Thunder does the Sherman's evolution through the tech tree in this game. The first variant of the Sherman that you ever get is the M4A1, which makes sense. The M4A1 was the first variant of the Sherman to enter production, so chronologically, actually, it makes sense. It beats the M4A2 by, I think, like a couple months. I think February of 1942 is when the M4A1 starts production. It's got all the early features. This very much looks like an early model M4A1 that you would have seen, say, in North Africa or Italy. Of course, me being me, I have all of the historically accurate sites. I downloaded all. I went on the War Thunder Skins website and I downloaded all the historically accurate sites. The 50 caliber is up on the cupola, which is great. That's how it was early on. The original plans for the 50 mounted on the turret of the Sherman was to put it up on the cupola for the commander to use. The problem, though, was that 50 cal was always meant for anti-aircraft work, and within the confines of the cupola, you couldn't aim the 50 high enough to actually shoot at planes. So that's why the 50 ends up getting moved to the rear of the turret, where you can stand on the engine deck and actually get low enough to shoot up at planes. But then obviously not having a machine gun anymore on the cupola upset some people, so they end up developing the 30 cal mount instead, and so now you can put a 30 cal on the cupola and then the 50 is on the back. As the war goes on, additional mounts are developed for the loader's side of the turret, and so you can get a pintle mount in front of the loader's hatch, and then at that point you start seeing all kinds of machine gun configurations. You like pretty much any mix and match of 50 cal, 30 cal in those three positions on the Sherman's turret, it happened. But in the early models, they only had the pintle on the cupola, and it was just for the 50. Really cool. It's represented here. Also represented in Gates of Hell Ostfront very, very well. Good on those guys for doing their homework too. I really like to show off this feature that I tried to use in War Thunder, but every single time it ends up making me really bad at the game because my shots don't go where I want them to. But there's actually an option in the game to have your camera, when you go into your gunner sights, actually be from where the gunner sight actually is. For those of you who don't know, by default, when you aim down your gunner sight, your sight is positioned inside the gun barrel and you're shooting. There's no parallax effect. Well, with this option, you can actually turn it so that you can see like your gun barrel and you can see the 50 on the roof in this Sherman example, because in this position, we're seeing it from the gunner's periscope. Because again, this is an early model M4A1 with the M34 gun mount. There is no telescopic front sight for the gunner. The only way he aims is through his periscope with the little magnifier inside of his periscope. And they actually modeled this correctly. Like, this is the correct position for the sight on these early vehicles. So bravo to them for modeling this. And yes, it does mean that at very close ranges, if you shoot, your shot will end up to the left. And in a game like War Thunder, where you kind of need precision shooting, it does get very annoying very quickly. So I try to play with it sometimes, but I do just end up getting frustrated and switch back to the default. Also, as a bonus to show off the M34A1 gun mantlet, so now it has a telescopic front sight, and you can see when I aim down my sights, it's in a different position. The 50 is no longer, you see, up in our way, and the gun, the optic is much more in line with the barrel. We can see the barrel really poking into our sight line, because now we are actually seeing out of the actual telescopic sight of the Sherman. So War Thunder even went through the effort of modeling the difference between the M34 and M34A1 gun sight. So that's really freaking cool. Stuff like that is the stuff that really tickles me, really gets me like excited. I love when that detail is provided in a game. I have to give a shout out to the track models on this game. Like, this is literally something I do just like for fun. I just drive the tanks over obstacles and watch the physics and animations of these tracks. I seriously can't think of another game that does this better. I mean, these are top-notch track physics. I think because War Thunder, they had an update, right, where they made the tracks actually 3D modeled physics objects. I mean, not actual physics objects, but they actually have 3D models, and they actually behave and interact with the wheels and the suspension. This really surprised me and impressed me, was when I'm here in this position driving over this trench, I actually, the wheels reach maximum travel downwards. They're just drooping, they're dangling, and the tracks actually sag below the wheels, and the wheels and the tracks are not touching. The tracks actually have additional sag below the wheels. It really shows that the tracks and the wheels and the running gear are actually separate elements that are interacting, they're not glued together. There's so many games where the tank just handles through its wheels, and then the tracks are purely cosmetic. Honestly, I have no idea if the tracks in this game actually have traction baked into them, although it seems like they do, because in a lot of games that do this, where the wheels are where you're getting all your traction and the tracks are just fake, things like your sprocket, especially your sprocket, but also your idler, don't have traction built into them. So when you hit a trench and your sprocket hits the other side of a trench, since your sprocket isn't a wheel that's being modeled with traction, your sprocket just turns on it, and it's like, but my tracks on the front of my sprocket should be grabbing that other side of the trench and pulling me over it. But whatever they did, it really creates the illusion that the tracks are physically modeled objects in this space, and they actually interact with the world, and that they're separate things. The way they bounce on the top of the return rollers when you hit things, it's not just like it's not just a set cycling animation. When you hit things, when you crash into things, when you dip and you drop into craters and things, the tracks will flex and bounce and actually like move around in actual real physics. Like, it looks so real. I honestly, if there's one thing I really want to glaze War Thunder for, I have to say it looks incredible. Like, the models are really well detailed and look really good, and the track links, like some of the best track physics I've seen in any video game ever. Like, this is really good stuff. And the fact that the sprocket teeth never end up out of sync with the end connectors, the fact that like you're really seeing the teeth getting into the gap on the end connectors and then actually pulling it around, like it is really good. It's genuine pornography is the best way I can put it. But then, this is where everything breaks down. This is something that I really have to mention here. War Thunder does not fundamentally understand the steering system of the Sherman. We have footage here of our Sherman tank as I'm just holding down W and A or D and turning in place. You can see I've got one track frozen, and it's to simulate you put your foot on the gas and you have the tillers and you pull one back and the tank can turn in place on a dime. The Sherman cannot physically do this. This is impossible. Now, without getting into a long-winded discussion of all the different steering and differential systems that are on tanks, the Sherman has a very specific one called a controlled differential. I've in the past also called it a double differential, although apparently that's a different thing. I've also seen Claytrek thrown around. I really don't know the exact terminology for it. I'm going to call it controlled differential because that's what makes the most sense to me. The way the Sherman's steering system works, if you want to turn right and you pull on the right stick, what that's doing is it is reducing the amount of power being sent to the right track, but also, unique to the controlled differential steering, increases power to the left track. So the right track spins slower, and then the left track actually spins faster. If you just put your foot on the gas and you leave the tillers alone, equal power is going to both sprockets. So both tracks are going at the same speed. When you pull a tiller, you slow down the one track and then you speed up the other, and that gives you a turn. A lot of other tank steering systems will have either a clutch mechanism or clutch braking, what's commonly called clutch brake steering. For example, in the T-34, where the final drives and the sprockets, there's a clutch in there. So when you pull on the tiller, it's disengaging that clutch. So it's literally disconnecting the tracks from the drive system. So it's not managing how much power is going to each track, it's just straight up cutting power to one of your tracks. And they just go limp. If you pull further back, it engages a brake which stops and locks the tracks, freezes the tracks. And then you can turn on a frozen track, like what we're seeing with our Sherman here. The Sherman does not have such a braking mechanism in its differential for its steering. It literally doesn't. No matter how far you pull back on that tiller in the Sherman, you can never cut power fully to your track, and you cannot stop your track dead, and you can't lock it up. You can only divert power so that your right track is going really, really slow and your left track is going really, really fast. As a result of this, the Sherman, quite famously, has a pretty large turning radius. And in fact, it was actually noted as a downside of both the M3 and the M4 in Soviet tests. I think officially the Soviets wrote that the Sherman had a 10-meter turning radius. The National Museum of Military Vehicles has a great video demonstrating them driving around on, it's a mock-up Sherman that was built for the TV show The Pacific, but its chassis on the bottom is I think it was a Grant. It's an M3, either a Lee or a Grant. They say so in the video, and they mention in the video how the Sherman cannot do what they call a zero turn, which is turning in place.
So I'm going to get a hard left on the stick to give it a little more throttle. And it just does not have a very tight turning radius at all. And I couldn't tell you what the turning radius is, but it's not real tight.
The Sherman can only kind of list one way or the other. These maneuvers that we're seeing here in War Thunder, the Sherman physically can't do this. Neither can the M3 and neither can the M2. So why? Why would you do this? Well, firstly, this was a differential system that was used on a lot of tractors and such at the time, so it was a differential system that was well understood. It's also actually, believe it or not, it's actually quite a simple mechanism. Although I might pop up diagrams and things and showing it working in an X-ray, it looks very, very complicated, but it's actually, relatively speaking, quite simple. And that was something the Soviets said they actually liked about the differential in the Sherman. It was simple and reliable. Also, with the steering system, it also is pretty much the big reason why the Sherman is so famously easy to drive. The T-34 has the clutch brake system, but obviously the T-34 is a nightmare to drive, right? They always said you knew a T-34 driver by how big his forearms were because you're working your full body doing those tillers. Whereas the Sherman, anyone, if you knew how to drive a car, you could jump into a Sherman and you could drive it no problem. It required so little effort to engage those tillers. You know, a car can't turn in place either, right? A car has to have a set turning circle. So the Sherman felt like driving a car. So you might think, well, hey, like you can't stop on a track and turn on a dime. Isn't that a huge issue? No, not really, because if you're used to dealing with a car with a limited turning circle, then you're used to dealing with a Sherman. And also, if you were at a low gear and you're going slow enough, you could still get some pretty tight turns. but again, nothing like what we're seeing in War Thunder. And obviously, this drastically affects gameplay. I mean, at least for me, like the Sherman is beloved in War Thunder for it's a good brawler tank, right? Like the Sherman's really good in urban environments in War Thunder because it's got a quick turret traverse, it's got a quick reload, it's got great penetration at close range, and it's got a quick come around a corner turning radius. But in real life, it didn't. You know, it's things like this when we say like War Thunder isn't realistic and War Thunder doesn't, like, it's not a be-all end-all, like you should never use video games as a proper be-all end-all source on things. It's because stuff like this just cannot be modeled in its entirety in a video game, right? Just at the very least, we haven't gotten there yet, or at the very least, War Thunder hasn't bothered to. So that's just sort of my cautionary tale of, it's both a fun fact and a bit of education, hopefully for you, learning how the Sherman's differential system actually worked and how steering and driving a Sherman actually was, and also a bit of a lesson in showing like, hey, like even though you might play a game like War Thunder and be like, this feels like it's right to me, there's always going to be some little detail where it's like, they got that way wrong. And that's going to be it for this episode of Tank Enthusiast Reacts. I'm cutting it. Oddly enough, I'm actually cutting this short. As per usual, when I film Tank Enthusiast Reacts, I end up doing something really dumb, which is I just sit here and ramble for what ends up being like 2 or 3 hours in the raw footage, and then I have to find a way to cut it down into a acceptable video. I was not originally intending for this video to be solely on the American tanks, the M2, the M3, and the M4, but for time, that's just what I had to do. So I've edited this part first, and we're gonna post this as a video as a War Thunder Sherman special, or M2, M3, M4 American tank special. But I think it fits because I'm also a massive Sherman nerd. I just got off the back of making a documentary on the M3 Lee. I literally just in the mail while making this video, I just received the technical manual for the M4 in the mail. So this is an awesome, I can't wait to make really cool videos about this, like reading sections from this or something. Anyway, if you're watching this for the War Thunder stuff, sorry, I'm not really a normal War Thunder YouTuber. If you're watching this for the tank stuff, there might be some stuff like this very much in the future. Check out my other videos if you haven't already. I'm gonna leave that open because I was just reading about stabilizers. So with that said, leave a like and subscribe if you really enjoyed this video. I have a Patreon that you can donate to. Huge shout out to my patrons who are actually also, by the way, getting an extended cut of this video. For them, it's looking like this is gonna be a 50-minute episode. So for whatever this ends up being for you guys, add on however many minutes to get to 50, and that's how much longer this video is gonna be for patrons. So there's no specific pledge amount. No matter what amount you donate, if you're a patron, and you all get the same benefits. If not, like I said, liking, subscribing, and sharing with friends, this kind of stuff is just the simplest way you can help me out and keep me doing what I love. Anyway, I don't know if I'm missing anything else. Join my Discord if you haven't already. Links to everything will be in the description. Research as well if you want some links to stuff to read about, to continue learning about some of the stuff I talk about in this video, citing some of my own sources, things that I've read, things that I think you might like. All that stuff's gonna be in the description. I always include that stuff in all my videos. But anyway, as much as I cut my intro short, I'm gonna have to cut the outro short. Let me know in the comments if you wanna see more of this. I have a bunch of footage already of German and Soviet vehicles, and even some variants of Shermans in other tech trees. And I think you guys might find that to be really, really fun. So, yeah, thanks for watching, and go away. That was funny, ha ha ha.